So this lesson is all about overtime. So sometimes you work a job and you have your regular hours, and sometimes if you work beyond your set regular hours, you get charged or get paid overtime. So you're making more money than what you would normally make per hour. Typically overtime pay, there are two different types. You basically have the option of some employers, depending on what your overtime hours are and what it is used for, you may be paid time and a half, which is basically taking whatever your hourly wage is, and you are going to multiply it by a factor of 1.5. So if you were, say you're making 10 bucks an hour, you multiply that by 1.5 to figure out what your time and a half rate would be if you had overtime hours. The second type is called double time, and we'll look at that one in the next lesson. But double time, just think double, right? Your hourly wage is basically going to get multiplied by a factor of 2. So you're working, basically you make 10 bucks an hour. If you were to make double time for overtime pay, you would be basically making 20 bucks an hour. So for every hour that you've worked overtime. So let's take a look at that and see what that looks like in practice. So we've got Julie working for the Mac's Corner Store, and she is paid at an hourly rate of $17.50. We want to know just basically if she was to get, if she was getting overtime at time and a half, we want to know what she would actually be getting paid per hour. So we want to know what her time and a half rate is. So all we would do is take what she is getting paid per hour and timesing it by, because it's time and a half, that's representing by, that we'd multiply by 1.5. So we are going to simply multiply 1750 by 1.5. And we are going to get where Julie, if she works any overtime and gets time and a half, she is actually going to get $26.25 per hour of overtime that she is working. So that's not a bad thing. There's lots of people that like to work overtime because for the fact that they make extra money. Okay, next one, we've got Marcus. Marcus is working for Mac's Corner Store. If he works basically a regular 40-hour week, he receives time and a half for any extra hours over and above the 40 hours. His hourly wage is $12.75, and we're asked to calculate his gross pay for each of these weeks. So basically what we're seeing is maybe for 1 month, right? Week 1, he worked 45 hours. We want to know what was his gross pay for that week. Then in week 2, he worked 52 hours. Then in week 3, 38, and so forth. So basically all this is asking us to do is just to find his gross pay. Okay, so we're not even going to worry about deductions in this case. We're just finding his gross pay. So initially then, if he worked 45 hours, well, if we look at his typical regular work week is 40 hours. So looking at this, 40 hours compared to 45, he's worked extra hours. He's actually worked 5 extra hours. He's went over his 40-hour week. So those 5 extra hours, he is going to get time and a half. So in order to figure out the gross pay, we know 40 hours, the first 40 hours, he is making $12.75 an hour. So that we can figure out his gross pay. So 40 times $12.75. $12.75 times 40 looks like he's making $510. Just if he worked only a 40-hour week, that's all he would make. Now, he actually worked an extra 5 hours. So the 5 hours, we have to multiply his hourly wage. In this case, he's taken the $12.75, but it's time and a half. So we're going to times it by 1.5. So his hourly wage gets multiplied by $12.75 by 1.5, and he had 5 of those hours. So we are looking at where he's made an additional, for those 5 hours, $95.63. So now for the week, all we're doing is we take his regular hours plus his regular 40-hour week, what he made, plus his overtime earnings, and add them together. So 510 plus the 95.63. And for week one, he's making $605.63. So we can go ahead with the next process through this. And again, that 40 hours times 1275. Okay, that first 40 is always going to be the same. He's not changing how much he makes at a regular hourly wage. So that is going to stay true every time we go through this. We look at the next part of this. Well, he worked 52 hours compared to 40. So really, if you look at this, this is 52 minus the 40. He worked an extra 12 hours overtime. So again, he worked an extra 12 hours at $12.75 times the time and a half, so that 1.5. So 12 times $12.75 times 1.5. He is making $229.50. So total, we take that plus the 510 that he made. He, for week two, has made $739.50. Now, week three, he's working 32 hours. Well, 32 hours is less than the 40. So in this case, he's not making any extra time. Like, he's not doing any overtime in this because he's under the 40. So we're simply just going to take the 32 hours that he worked at his basic hourly wage of $12.75. And we are going to find out that when we multiply that together, he only made $408 that week. Which makes sense because if he worked 40 hours, he would be 510. So definitely he worked less, he's going to be making less. Now, the last week, he worked 48 hours. So same thing, we're back to that basic, he's working over the 40-hour week. So he's got the 40 hours times the $12.75, which gives him $510. Now he worked 8 extra hours. So we'll take the 8 times the $12.75. And because that's overtime, we're timesing it by the time and a half. So now I take $12.75 times the 8 times the 1.5, and I am finding out that he made an extra $153. So the 153 plus the 510, in week 4, he made $663. Now, again, remember, this is his gross pay. So this is all before any deductions that are coming off. So it looks good, but in reality, once you take some deductions off, those numbers are going to drop too. Okay, let's look at another example. So at Mac's Corner Store, this time Tom earns $24.50 an hour, and his overtime rate is time and a half. His regular work week is 40 hours. If he earned $1,250 in 1 week, how much did he earn at regular pay? So this one's kind of working a little bit backwards with what we're used to doing. So we know in total how much he made for the week. We know a basic regular work week for him is 40 hours. He earns $24.50 for an hour. His overtime rate is time and a half. So right now, if he earned this, we need to know, well, what happens if how much he'd earn at regular pay? Well, regular pay would mean that he'd be working those 40 hours at his regular rate, which is $24.50. So if I do that, $24.50 times 40 gives me, at regular rate, he's only making $980. So to me, when I look at that, that's telling me because he worked and made $1,250, that he's actually had some overtime hours in there, had to have, in order to get beyond 980, especially when if you work 40 hours, this is all you're getting. So his regular pay, that's his regular pay. What were his overtime earnings? Well, earnings just talks about money, right? Well, let's look. Overall, we know that this is what he took, what his gross pay was for 1 week. This is what he would earn at regular pay. So if we want to find out how much he made in overtime, well, we're simply going to take the $1,250 and subtract from it that regular pay. And what we should have left is how much he earned in overtime. So in this case, $220.50. That's his actual overtime money that he earned. Now the question is how many hours did he work overtime? So we know how much he made in overtime. We know how many hours we don't know, because we don't know. We know what he makes. We know what his overtime rate will be. So if we know his overtime rate, or we can figure it out, and we know how much money he made, we can actually figure out how many hours. Because his overtime will simply be his hourly wage times his hours. Okay, so this is hourly wage. So in essence, his overtime rate, if we look at his overtime rate, well, we're simply taking his $24.50, timesing it by time and a half, so timesing it by 1.5, and we are finding out that he actually makes $36.75 per hour for overtime rate. So essentially his hourly wage will be $36.75. We know his overtime, he made $220.50. We just don't know how many hours he made. So in essence here, because we are multiplying to find that, we're going to divide this 36.75 from both sides. 36.75, and we discover that his hours that he worked, if we take 220.7 to 20.5 divided by 36.75, we discover that he worked 6 hours of overtime pay. So essentially, we knew how much he made in overtime. We were able to figure out what his hourly wage was, and if once we knew that, we could divide them out and get how many hours he actually worked. Okay, Sean works for Mac's Corner Store. He worked 52 hours last week. His hourly wage is $14.75, and his overtime is paid at time and a half for anything over 40 hours. So we want to know, what is his gross pay for the week? Well, gross pay is everything included, so we have to start initially with his regular pay. So his regular pay of 40 hours is at $14.75. So we take those 40 hours, times it by the $14.75, and we get that he makes $590 for the 40 hours that he's working. Problem is, he's worked over and above 40 hours. He's worked an extra 12 hours. And he's going to get charged time and a half, which means we're going to take his hourly wage and we're going to times it by 1.5. So that means if we take the 12 times the 14.75 times the 1.5, we find out that he makes $265.50 extra in his overtime. So if we want to know his total gross pay, we're going to add these two together. So that means we're going to take the $590 plus the $265.50, and he makes $855.50. That's his gross pay for a 52-hour week. So now B says if his regular deductions are 18% of his gross pay, and he pays $17.50 for healthcare, and he pays another $4.75 for parking, we want to know his net pay. So in this question, now we're pulling in what we learned from the previous lesson on net pay. So net pay is just taking your gross and then subtracting from it all of your deductions. So we've got this in terms of money for deduction. We've got this in terms of money for deduction. This 18%, we need to get it into money so that we can subtract it off of our gross. So remember the percentage, we always want to change this to a decimal when we're working with it. So in order to get the money of this, we're taking 18% of the gross pay, which is $855.50. So we're going to multiply those two together. So 0.18 times $855.50. So deductions for all of those basic regular deductions, your federal income tax, provincial, CPP, EI, that all works out to that. Now, we have additional deductions of $17.50. We have parking for $475. So if I take and add all of those deductions up, I am going to find that my total deductions are $176.24. That's deductions. Now, I'm asked to find what his net pay is. So to find net pay, I'm going to take my gross and I'm going to subtract from it my deductions. Well, my gross from the previous question was $855.50. My deductions, what I just figured out, were $176.24. So now if I subtract those, I know that Sean is taking home only $679.26. So it looks like Sean's taking a bunch of money home at $855, but now when we take into account all the deductions that he needed to take off of there, we're actually down to $679.26. So probably a good thing that he worked some overtime hours to increase how much he actually gets to take home. Okay, last question. We've got Denise working for Mac's Corner Store. She worked 48 hours last week. Her hourly wage is $15.55, and her overtime is paid at time and a half for everything over 40 hours. So again, what's her gross pay for the week? Well, we know 40-hour work week for sure because she's 48 hours. She's went beyond at a basic rate of $15.55. So knowing that, we're going to take the 40 times the $15.55. And we know that Denise is making $622 just in her regular hours of 40 hours. Now, she's working an additional 8 hours, which means that her regular hourly wage is going to get times by 1.5 to account for that time and a half for overtime. And so we're going to take the 8 times the $15.55 times the 1.5. And she made extra $186.60. So her gross pay, if we add these two together, works out to $808.60. Now, again, that's gross. So in the next question, it says if her regular deductions are 23% of her gross pay, that's a high percentage, and she pays $22.85 for healthcare, what is her net pay? So now we want to know what is she actually walking home with. So in this case, that percentage again, let's divide it by 100, which is going to give me 0.23. So that means I'm going to take 0.23 of my gross earnings, which are $808.60. So 0.23. So that means those deductions, she is going to have this for a value. Now, I purposely wrote the 3 digits in here again, just as a reminder when we're dealing with money, you're going to get, we can only have 2 decimal places. So you look to that third decimal, and if it's larger than 5, it's going to bump the next decimal to it up by 1. So in this instance, you have $185.98. That's what we have for deductions in those regular deductions. So we have the $185, but we also, she has $22.85 in healthcare. So if we take that and add it with the regular deductions, 22.85, total deductions are $208.83. So this is her total deductions. We're asked to, so we can't stop just there because we're asked to find her net pay. We needed to know what those deductions were so that we could go through the process of finding what her net pay is. And her net pay is simply her gross subtracting her deductions. So in this case, her gross is $808.60, and we're subtracting from it the $208.83. So when we do that, 808.60 subtract 208.83, we discover that she is only going home with $599.77. And that is how you calculate overtime, and specifically looking at time and a half. Now you can go on and work on your practice.